Okay, good morning, everybody. I think we've given the rest a few more minutes. On behalf of SAMED and IQVIA, we'd like to welcome you to this morning's regulatory forum. My name is Jonathan Berger, and I'm a member of the SAMED Market Access Committee, and I'll be your facilitator for the day. Before we start, I would like to show by way of hands if you can all hear me, and we can see the screen clearly. Everybody okay? Good. You can hear, you can see? Great. Awesome. Okay, great.
Jonathan, we can hear you, not currently sharing.
Okay, perfect. Okay, before we get started, I'd like to cover a few formalities for the day. Just would like to draw your attention to the previous slide shown by Caroline regarding the recording, conflicts and interest and competition law. So basically the meeting is held today with no intent to collude or engage in any manner that might contravene competition law. Conflicts of interest must be declared, and if required, members recuse themselves either before or during the meeting, as and when they become apparent. And the meeting has been recorded for record purposes only, and by participating, you consent to the recording thereof. Okay, in terms of the agenda for the day, we'll be looking at the presentations from about 12:25, up to about 12:25, at which point we'll then take a short break for 10 minutes. We'll return at 12:35, where the final leg of the workshop will be presented, followed by key takeaway messages, and then closing at around 1:30 for the latest. We're trying to keep to that time. If you have any specific questions for the speakers, I ask that you please reserve them. We have a few minutes after each presentation for you to do so. But please feel free to also include them in the chat, or alternatively, please raise your hand and we'll recognize you after each presentation to ask your questions. We also have a few polls and opportunities within the session for questions, so we encourage you to please participate so that you will have the most out of the session. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the team of IQVIA, who will unpack meaningful and quality evidence generated from medical devices and IVDs. They're joined by Andrew Vincent, the MedTech business lead for IQVIA, who will provide us with more information about his team shortly. Following that, we are also joined by Michelle Bulliard, Irene Bezemer, Sue Bailey, Brenda Swiskantha, and Dr. Surab Kumar to the session. We look forward to the insights that we will be hearing from today, and we now hand over to Andrew to introduce the team. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for the very warm welcome. And also, very briefly, I'd like to extend my thanks to Tanya Vocht and the rest of the SAMED board for allowing us to participate and workshop this critical topic with all of your members today. Your team have been a pleasure to work with in putting this together, and most notably Caroline Scott, who has worked tirelessly in the background to make this happen. And we're grateful for all her assistance up until now. So it's my great pleasure to welcome everybody to this market access workshop as we navigate some key topics related to market access and how you and your teams can successfully traverse these. So over the course of the next 90 minutes or so, as Jonathan mentioned, I really encourage all of you to engage with us, ask us as many questions as you possibly can, and essentially treat it as it is. It's a workshop, so let's workshop these subjects that our subject matter experts will cover, such as real-world evidence generation, health economics, and of course, managing the ever-changing regulatory landscape. So with that, I'm going to ask the team to briefly introduce themselves individually. I know Jonathan has briefly introduced them as well, but I'm going to ask Michelle Bulliard to lead the introductions, after which Michelle will cover some of the key goals and objectives that this workshop will cover, and then take you through in some more detail the agenda for today, and then lead us into our first set of poll questions. So Michelle, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, SAMED, also for this opportunity to talk to you today and run this workshop on the topic of real-world evidence. So my name is Michelle Bouliard. I'm the Vice President and Global Head of IQVIA MedTech Real-World Solutions. My role, I'm really responsible for looking at what's the most optimal way to generate evidence using real-world evidence and real-world data that then you can go ahead and use to meet the needs of your stakeholders. So looking forward to this workshop with you today. So I'll hand over to my colleague Irene. Now, I think Irene may have some technical issues with being able to open up the microphone. Irene, can you talk? Can you introduce yourself? So maybe as we try and sort out the issue with Irene, I can maybe hand over to Brenda to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Michelle. My name is Brenda Sriskantha, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here today at this workshop. I work with Michelle in the Global MedTech group within the Real World Solutions organization at IQVIA. And in my role, I'm supporting our MedTech customers with developing solutions and offerings for them across the total product lifecycle. I'm looking forward to this session today. I'll hand over to Irene, who I see is on now. I think you're on mute, Irene.
Yes, there I am. Can everybody hear me? Good. Thank you for allowing me to put on my camera and my microphone. Yes, my name is Irene Beesemer, Epidemiology Director at IQVIA, obviously. And today I will walk you through the design and data sourcing options that we have in the real world. So nice to meet you all.
So over to you, Sue. Yes.
Hi. So good morning, everybody. I'm Sue Bailey, and I'm based in South Africa. And my responsibility is for our clinical trial delivery across Middle East and Africa. So leveraging some of our knowledge from running clinical trials in the traditional space to how we can evolve that in the real world space. So very much looking forward to developing this and discussing with you through the workshop today.
So I see myself as next. So hi everyone, this is Dr. Saurabh. I'm director for HEOR. I lead the HEOR Health Economics and Outcome Research Delivery team based out of India. The team has got 3 verticals: the medical writing, literature review, and the HE modeling. So the team is responsible for delivery of studies in the real world solutions across multiple therapy areas and medtech devices. Excited to be part of this webinar today. Thank you. Andrew.
Thanks, Dr. Kumar. Andrew Vincent, and I lead our MedTech business unit in South Africa. Michelle, back to you.
Thank you. So if we move on to the next slide, what I want to do, we put together 4 goals for this workshop. Again, it's a workshop for all of you. So the first goal that we set was that you walk away really understanding the value of real world evidence in an evolving landscape and how you can effectively incorporate it into your total product life cycle for your medical devices, your in vitro diagnostic devices, and digital health softwares, medical devices. We will then take a look at the evolving regulatory landscape and look at the evolving standards and guidance that are being used for post-market surveillance studies. And then we will look at, the goal will be to understand more about the different epidemiologic study design methods and when to apply one method over another. And then finally, the 4th goal to walk away with is really to learn more about the operational approaches, patient centricity and health economic modeling whilst you generate real world data. So to achieve these goals, we put together a comprehensive, very nice agenda on the next slide. And let me just quickly walk you through each of the modules and what we will be covering and who are the speakers. So just following this opening, Andrew will give a brief introduction to actually who we are, IQVIA MedTech, and the capabilities that we have in South Africa. Africa. Then I will follow with a short session, just really setting the scene on looking at the value of real world evidence. How do we define it? And what's actually driving the need today? We're all on this workshop today to understand more about real world evidence. So what's driving the need and how you can use real world evidence to meet your multi-stakeholder needs. So whether it's for the regulators, your payers, providers, the patients, for your own company, how you can use the data and effectively use it. We will then take a quick look at navigating the landscape. It's highly evolving, the area of real world evidence. So what we want to do is just take a look at upcoming or new or evolving standards and guidance for real world evidence studies. That'll be covered by myself and by Sue. And then we'll move into the next module looking at the epidemiologic methods, where Irene will really cover a fantastic session looking at best practices to generate real world evidence, looking at different study designs, randomized controlled trials versus real world studies. And then how can you apply the right data, design and approach to answer your research question. And then she'll also take a look, as we're working with real world data, what are the design considerations? What's the potential for bias in real world studies and how you can address this? And then before closing out the session, she'll also just cover some more of the more novel, innovative study designs that you can be considering using real world evidence. And she'll have also some case studies within the session to bring it to life. Then the last session is looking at the operational methods to generate high quality real world evidence. So you have your excellent study design, you're answering your research question to meet your stakeholder needs. Now you have to effectively deliver your project. So we'll also look at the best practices from an operational perspective. Then we look at different ways you can collect the data, going from site-based studies to hybrid, so site-based with a direct to patient, and then looking at a decentralized approach. We'll then take a look at how you can implement a patient-centric approach and why you should be implementing a patient-centric approach into your real-world studies. We'll then take a look at, importantly, health economic modeling. So reimbursement is important to ensure that you can obtain it and maintain it for your medical device. So Dr. Saurabh will be covering the health economic modeling session. And then whatever evidence you generate, it has to be underpinned by quality standards, high quality, you need to generate high quality data. So we look at how can you maximize the quality of the data you're generating in a real world setting. And then we'll just close out by looking at how we see the future use of real world evidence. So each of the sessions, we will, at the end of each session, open up for questions and answers. We encourage you, as Jonathan highlights as well, to engage in questions and answers. But ongoing, if you do have questions come up, just post them in the chat box as well. Of course, just importantly to mention, we'll also have a short break after Irene's session as well. So with that, again, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this this workshop, and I will hand back to Andrew.
Thanks, Michelle. Before I kick off into a bit of history and background with regards to IQVIA, Caroline, if you don't mind launching the first poll question, please. We'll just give everybody a quick opportunity to respond to this, just a minute or so. If you could go to the next slide as well, please, Brenda. Okay, thanks, Caroline. I don't know if we've recorded any responses, but be that as it may, we will continue given given the time that we have. So briefly, IQVIA MedTech is uniquely positioned covering all aspects of the medtech product lifecycle from concept right through to patient. And as you can see there, we cover all areas right from research and discovery right through to supporting your commercial operations. Of course, today we are focusing on a unique aspect within that life cycle, and that is real world evidence and then some health economics and outcomes research. But what's important to note is at the bottom, real world evidence solutions actually cuts across all of those key areas right through from concept to patient. Real world evidence generation does not exist in a particular silo in research and discovery, in product development, or in commercial. You're actually generating evidence or real world evidence in each and every aspect of that total product life cycle. And that's an important takeaway point, which Michelle and the team will elaborate on in more detail later during the workshop. Next slide, please, Brenda. So you might be wondering who IQVIA is. IQVIA is the result of a merger and acquisition that happened in 2016 between IMS Health and Quintiles. And that came with a local acquisition with a company by the name of Impact RX in South Africa. We have roughly 70,000 employees globally, of which you can see here we have just over 1,000 employees, with most of those 950 based in our research and development solutions team. We have a very small team in our solutions division based in South Africa, and all of these divisions, or both of these divisions, have medtech or medical device knowledge and or capabilities. So from a research and development solutions perspective, as I said, that's where the bulk of our headcount sits. Extensive project delivery expertise, 250 global projects since 2012, and that covers the entire healthcare sector, including medtech, pharma, and biotech. And of course, we have an established footprint in South Africa, not just South Africa, right across Africa. Regulatory and clinical knowledge with established relationships with SAPRA and various ethics committees, and as well SACRA. Flexible full service trial delivery. So if you are looking to do full clinical trials for any device product in South Africa, we are uniquely positioned to assist you with that. From a solutions perspective, we have a singular focus on healthcare. We don't play in any other space. We just do healthcare. And those three verticals that sit under our healthcare portfolio would be medical devices or medtech, our pharma business, as well as consumer health. And with that, we have 450 plus experienced and trusted advisors in the medtech space, both locally and globally, who assist us with expertise in the devices space. Local market and expertise, and as a very strong stakeholder network, and of course, quick access to proprietary knowledge and data within South Africa, not just local data, but also global data, is underpins everything that we do. And we do have a very distinctive approach to end-to-end services, where we combine commercial, clinical, manufacturing, and regulatory capabilities. Thanks, Brenda. Very briefly, just on a separate business unit of ours, which exists across Africa and globally, and that's our contract sales and medical solutions team, who provide unique, bespoke, outsourced solutions across Africa, which give you or provide you with flexible resourcing options. Most notably, and probably most relevantly for the medtech and the devices industry, is our incomparable smart recall solution for devices, which digitizes the entire recall process, which is a challenge synonymous with the device industry in managing recalls, but also identifying product and where that product is at any given time and being able to track and trace a particular product. Next slide, please, Brenda. So coming back to our information services and our commercial and how we support commercial organizations in the devices or the medtech industry, we have developed a information audit which focuses on market share, trends and growth by quarter, which contains 12 months historical data and multiple product and demographic views, which is hospital level consumption data, which is available in a monthly delivery with obviously monthly refresh. The second one I'd like to highlight, which is due for release from us in Q2 this year, so anytime from April onwards, and that's our procedural insights information audit, which it will cover roughly 70% of all private sector procedures in South Africa, and that data will be sourced directly from the practice management software within the surgeon's practice. And that'll be granular down to a brick level and will include ICD-10 codes as well as descriptions and CPT codes as well as descriptions. And that'll be available in a monthly refresh and delivery and will include all disciplines. I think the one thing that sets that apart as well is there is reimbursement data in that set of data that we're receiving, which includes co-pays and amount paid per procedure split by schemes. So very, very granular in terms of if you're looking at a reimbursement model or you're looking at doing some health economics modeling, that will be something quite useful. All of this is then underpinned by our industry-leading product classification guide, which contains 25 plus core product classes, and then each core product class then has 7 subclasses, so you're able to really segment and target your market from a product perspective, and there you can view by product, by brand, by nappy, or by manufacturer, and that is down to region, town, and brick level. There's some other things that you could do with the data as well. You can do market sizing, competitor benchmarking. You can also set country targets. You can also load all of this data into a rep focus application, which is available for download on a smartphone to any of your sales reps or key account managers. Next slide, Brenda. Coming back to the smart recall solution, we do have some fantastic technology offerings, and one that we'd like to highlight is our track and trace capability for consignment stock in South Africa. It is an industry-wide challenge to be able to measure, locate, prioritize, move, and of course, identify where stock is at any given moment. Next slide, Brenda. So our real world services, again, fit for purpose, real world evidence operations. We have many unique examples where we've conducted real world and post-market studies, even direct to patient studies. And we have, as mentioned, a very unique access to global data and over 1 billion non-identified patient records. We do work very closely with some academic committees and international partnerships. We've mentioned SACRA, the South African Clinical Research Association, and there are many others we could highlight here, ISPOR being one on a global level. Next slide, Brenda. So just to finish off the introductory sort of section, so IQVIA MedTech and the use of RWE across the total product lifecycle, we've mentioned this. So for pre-approval, of course, designed to increase efficiency, reduce costs and improve device speed to market. That's of course critical for all of you. And then post-approval to demonstrate real-world safety, performance, and effectiveness. If you're looking to talk to funders or providers and get reimbursement for a particular product. So thank you very much. I really hope it gives you a very brief overview of IQVIA and what we have to offer in the devices space.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew, very much. We appreciate the introduction. I don't see any questions at this point for this segment in the chat box or on the raising hand. So we'll then hand over back to yourself, Andrew and Michelle.
Thank you, Jonathan. And actually, just before moving on to this session, just to comment on the polling question to everyone, thank you for sending in your responses. So we're showing 47% are considering post-market studies, followed closely behind by 38% for the health economics outcome research. And what's actually interesting is this is also what we're seeing globally is now and as we'd be going through the workshop as well, the increased focus on the need to generate safety data for your devices. So we'd be looking at how you can effectively generate that data and in a cost-effective way, and follow closely behind also by health economic modelling and HOR. So hopefully we'll be able to support you with your planned future needs as well. So just to set the scene, I'll just be talking about the value of real-world evidence. We're just going to open up the session as well with one polling question. Jonathan, if you can pull it up, that would be great. So our question is, which stakeholder are you most interested in generating real-world evidence for? The regulator, the payers, the HCP, the surgeons and patients, and the manufacturer, so for your own organization, or all of the above? So just give everyone a couple of minutes just to send in your responses. And that'll also help us as we kind of go through the workshop to make sure we're giving you the right messaging and content as well. So far we're seeing actually all of the above, 41% for all of the above. So let's move on to our next session. So starting off is we're all here to learn more about real world evidence. What actually is real world evidence? And there are many definitions going around, and sometimes it's hard to even articulate what it is. And I find this definition I've taken from, it's a guidance that was published in 2017 from US FDA. Very simple definition, but I think really well described. So real world data, when we talk about it, we're talking about data that's relating to patient health status and or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. And the important word there is routinely collected. Now, when we talk about real world evidence, so this is the clinical evidence regarding the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medical product derived from the analysis of the real world data. And Brenda, if you just do one more click on the slide. So if we kind of summarize that, we take real world data. So this is patient level data collected in a routine healthcare setting, and not collected from your conventional interventional clinical trials. We then process that data using the right epidemiologic biostatistical methods. We analyze that data. And from that, we can generate the evidence then that you can use to support your claims and address the evidence and demands for your multi-stakeholders. So moving on to the next slide is what's changing today for MedTech. And actually, sorry, just one more. When we talk about the real world data sources, what are the different sources? And we have, if we kind of start on the left at around maybe 9 o'clock registries, your traditional medical device registries, data coming from the registries can be considered as a valid source for generating the evidence. So registries, you have patient reported data, which we're actually seeing more more and more. You have your observational studies, prospective studies and retrospective studies, which we will be going through in further detail. More and more, we're also now looking to see, can we use claims data, hospital data, electronic medical record data, pharmacy data? And then in the top here, these are more of the novel emerging areas where we're looking at now generating data from consumer data, from social media data, applying natural language processing to social media data, looking for potential adverse events. On devices, looking at clinical outcomes assessments reported by physicians and surgeons, lab data, genomic data, mortality data, and then really importantly, patient-generated data. This is a new, if I can say, evolving space as well, and we'll be talking about patient centricity and what's important to the patient. So patient-generated is giving us new insights to patient outcomes that we actually didn't have before. We'll be talking to you about what is patient-generated data and how we can collect this and apply a patient-centric approach in our studies. And moving on to the next slide is, so what we want to do is, as we look at real-world evidence, understand what's happening in the landscape today. And I think one of the reasons we're all here today as well is there's increased interest in real-world evidence today. And driving that is also increased availability of real-world data. We have much greater access to data now, whether it's through connected devices, wearables, biosensors, electronic medical records, or traditional approaches of collecting real-world data. We have greater access to it. But what's important around this, when you get access to this real-world data, is as in industry, we're getting much better at analyzing this data, large data sets of observational data, and applying advanced analytics, even now taking it a step further and looking at applying artificial intelligence and machine learning to see, can you assess predictive outcomes of patients. And then importantly, there's ever expanding applications. So with the access to this data and better means to analyze it, we're now seeing greater use of it. And when I say greater use, as Andrew kind of highlighted on the last slide of the session, we're now looking at using real world evidence across the product life cycle. So in the traditional post-market setting, but also looking at using it early in your device development as well. And we've included here some really nice references of recent publications that you'll have access to as well, also just to bring this to life. Now, when I'm talking about the last one, ever expanding applications, and there's an example here of real world evidence being used for regulatory decision making. Just want to move to the next slide just to actually show to you what's happening around the world when we look at the evolving regulatory landscape. And what we're seeing now, that across the world, regulators are putting into place new legislation, new guidance, new standards on the use of real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making. And I think once we see that happening, of course, this will drive greater standards and quality in these studies, but there's a much better adoption on the use of real-world evidence by our multi-stakeholders, whether it's by the payers, the providers, by the regulators as well. And on this map, and I won't be going through it all, but it's more just to show you, if even just look at the dates, these are all just recent dates over the last 12, 24 months, even over the last 4 weeks or so. And it's something we keep a close eye on, but the common message is that it's global now. And what we need to be doing with this increased adoption of real world evidence is looking at smart ways you can use it to support with your product lifecycle management. So if we move on to the next slide, and just what I want to do is highlight to you, this report was published in March of last year by FDA CDRH, so the medical device division of the FDA. And the reason I want to highlight it to you is that they have published 90 case studies on the use of real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making. So FDA approved of devices, the regulatory approval using real-world evidence, and it's a really nice reference and source for you to look at. And this data was used for indication, label expansion, and was also used for post-market studies. And then the different data sources that were used, multiple sources, registries, claims data, medical records, and the patient and device generated data. But importantly, when you just look at the quote from Jeff Shern, who heads up the CDRH, he's saying, by unleashing the power of real-world evidence, we can accelerate medical product development and bring new innovations and advances faster and more efficiently to the patients who need them without compromising patient safety. And I think as an industry, this is where we're going and what we see happening with the use of real-world evidence. So my final slide to close out this session is before moving into the epidemiologic methods is we talk about value of real world evidence. And I like to say value is in the eye of the stakeholder. All of your stakeholders have questions to ask around your devices, and they all have different questions that they're looking for answers on. Whether it's the regulators asking for, you know, is the device safe? Is it effective? Payers looking on the value and coverage of your device. For your physicians, they want to make informed decisions on how their patients can have best outcomes using your device. Patients now more and more are having a greater voice. I want to know, what are my treatment choices for my device? What are the risks? What are the benefits? And what's the patient experience with this device? And of course, for your own, you know, companies as well, is for all of your strategy and planning and establishing the value. What's important to say, all of these questions, all different questions, they can now increasingly be answered using real-world evidence. And this is what we're going to be covering today. How can you answer these questions with real-world evidence? And then taking it even to another step, doing it in a smart way that you can answer multi-stakeholder questions under one study design, under one approach as well. So with that, I hope you're going to enjoy this workshop. I'm going to hand over to Irene, who will then cover the regulatory landscape. Oh, I apologize. We have one other short session before. My apologies for that. So just a very quick kind of, we're going to take a look at navigating the regulatory landscape. And this is more so just looking at standards to be aware of and evolving standards to take into account as you embark on your studies to generate real world evidence. So moving on to the first slide, Brenda, and actually this ties into the first polling questions where we had 45%, you know, saying they're looking to generate evidence for post-market surveillance. And we say, what's driving this change for increased post-market surveillance? And I think what we're seeing today is in industry, medical devices are becoming more complex, more sophisticated, more innovative devices entering into the market, as well as also more personalized devices as well. And the stakeholders, the regulators, are looking for safety data, especially long-term outcomes. We may not have the long-term outcomes from the clinical development studies. So looking for long-term safety and performance of the device when used in a real-world setting. Also, I think one of the important drivers of this is also there has been a lot of device scandals in the media, from metal on metal hip implants, pelvic mesh implants, breast implants as well. And this has also driven a greater focus on the safety of devices in a real world setting, driving regulators and other stakeholders looking for more post-market data on your devices as well. And what we're seeing now is the more evidence you can generate on your data, you can have a more comprehensive evidence portfolio to demonstrate the safety and performance of your device in the market. And of course, what we all want to do is also improve the quality of treatment and outcomes as well. So moving on to the next slide. I wanted just also to highlight, you're probably already familiar with the IMDRF, so the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum. And what they're doing is they are looking to harmonize the regulatory approach. We have very diverse regulations around the globe on for medical devices, especially in the post-market space. So they're looking at how can we harmonize these approaches. I also just wanted to highlight, so the affiliates, there's the Global Harmonization Working Party, I think was previously recognized or called the AHWP, the Asian, but it's expanded now to global, and that South Africa are a member of this, also looking at how we can harmonize these global regulations. IMDRF published in March 2021 their final guidance on post-market clinical follow-up studies. So if you're not familiar with this, I recommend to take a look at it. In this guidance, they do highlight that the use of data generated from real-world evidence is an important data source. And this is what we're now seeing happening around the world as well, using more and more real-world data to satisfy the needs to demonstrate the safety of your devices. And on to our next slide. So I'm going to go through very quickly just a few, 2 or 3 of the ISO standards. So of course, 13485, you're all very familiar with. But this is also driving the continuous ongoing improvement of our medical devices. And we apply what we call the PDCA plan, plan, do, check and act, the Deming cycle. Within this, we say check your device, it's continuous, checking on the ongoing safety of the device in a real world setting. So this is one of the standards that we do need to apply as we're looking at post-market surveillance. On to our next one. We have the ISO 14155. And the reason I wanted to call this out to you that in the 3rd edition that was published back in July 2020, for the first time ever, it has included non-interventional studies. And I think this is also showing an important change. We're talking about, global harmonization of our post-market safety studies. So the ISO 14155, which are good clinical practice for our medical device studies, now includes post-market clinical investigations. It includes medical device registries and non-interventional clinical investigations. Sorry, my phone rang. Clinical investigations. So I just want to highlight when we're talking about a non-interventional study. So this means that, and it's just in the little grey box here on the right, is the device is used in accordance with its approved labeling. And in the study that the assignment of the patient to a particular medical device is not decided in advance. It falls within current clinical practice. And then you're just going to observe the outcomes of the patient, the outcomes on use of the device in the real world setting. And there'll be no additional invasive or burdensome monitoring procedures on the patient. And then importantly, they highlight that you will use epidemiologic methods to analyze the collection of data. And this is what Irene also will be covering, these epidemiologic methods as well. So moving on to the next slide. The other one I wanted to mention is for IVD studies. So this is ISO 20916. ISO 20916 has actually a very nice flowchart in it. How do you decide, is my clinical performance study for my IVD an interventional study or a non-interventional study? So just to summarize it here, when will my IVD study be non-interventional? And this can be in both the pre-market and the post-market market setting. These studies are different where you're testing specimens ex vivo. So in these studies, the test results that are generated during the study do not influence patient management. You're using them to assess the performance of your IVD device or clinical validation of it. And any specimens that are collected, so they highlight here that leftover patient specimens will be used. So any biopsy specimen, it was already collected as part of standard of care, and you're just going to use some leftover specimen. Or if you do collect a specimen within the study, it doesn't pose additional risk. So just to put that into perspective, that would be maybe if you're collecting for you're developing a liquid biopsy test, for example, it could be collecting a blood test, it could be collecting a urine sample. So a sample that's not going to be invasive or burdensome to the patient. So we move on to the next slide. Going to hand over to Sue, who will just close out the session, just highlighting regulatory considerations when you are launching your study in South Africa.
Thanks, Michelle. So to bring it a little bit closer to home, we've got a lot of expertise running earlier phase IP-led studies. But as Michelle has been explaining, and the evolution that we're seeing in the real world evidence and more adjacencies from a medical device IVD perspective, we're quite excited about the future growth of these markets locally as well. So just to make sure everyone's kind of, as Michelle has been referencing in the previous slides, the regulations that we operate under. So from a South African clinical trial practice, regulated by SAPRA, and we conduct studies under SAGCP, which version 3 was just released in November last year. October last year. So we've got a pretty stringent regulator, and that's generally seen as a positive from a clinical trial market perspective, where we are seen as an attractive destination for research, clinical research, South Africa. So we do know though that it's a challenge from a device perspective, because some of the regulations currently in play do not really account for the differences between addressing an investigational product versus a device type of product. And so I know there are people on the line who are in working groups addressing this with SAPRA, and we hope to see some movement on that in due course. It is also important just to note that as a requirement, we do need to register any clinical trials, any trials that are running on the South African National Clinical Trials Registry. It is a requirement per the guidances. And then looking more to the space in the post-market environment, generally the process that needs to be followed, and this is fairly practical. We just have a notification to SAPRA, but the key aspect lies with the ethics and independent review boards for their approval from a more patient safety perspective. So we follow that process. Generally, there may also be a Department of Health approval that needs to be received in order to access patient records in addition. We have the benefit, all of our documentation can be submitted in English, and with just the translated informed consent and patient materials translated after the notification, after the initial submission. And it is very important. We do sometimes see a gap in this, that the sponsor indemnity is in place, and we've got the relevant delegation letters as well. And on average, even in general on our clinical trials, our early phase trials, we're pretty quick to start up in the global context. And from a post-market environment, the timelines there between 8 to 12 weeks really that we experience. So it is pretty competitive in the global landscape of getting these trials up and running. So that's it from a local perspective. Michelle, back to you.
Thank you. So I think we move on to the next session, Brenda. And I'm going to hand over to Irene for this session, and we'll also open up with a polling question. And again, any questions that you have as we're going through the slides, don't hesitate to raise your hand, and we can, or also, you know, let us know if you'd like to call out your question. It's over to you, Irene.
Thank you, Michelle. Just let me switch on my camera again. Let me know if you can hear me and see me well.
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah,
good.
and see.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, so we are starting with another polling question. The section, polling question number 3. And the question is now coming up. And really, the section is about epidemiology and study design methodology, actually. The question whether you have experience in the following study designs: retrospective observational, prospective observational, a database study, a randomized controlled trial, or all of the above, or several of the above. And that's the full answer. A lot of RCTs coming in. No, all of the above yet. Good day. Hello. So we have 9 responses at the moment. See if anything more comes in. Could have added an option, no clue, if you first want to learn a bit more about the study designs. Yeah, 11 responses, going well. Thank you all for participating. Yeah, just let me, well, maybe some more answers come in, slowly start a section. So the section is about epidemiology, study design. I like to call it methodology. And actually all of the above were potential RWE designs. In this section, we will walk through the data sourcing and design options that we have in the real world. And we will illustrate how we can complement evidence from their controlled trial setting with evidence from daily clinical practice. So in the slide that you see here, this is really aimed to illustrate the purpose of real-world studies. So as I just mentioned, the studies are to complement what we know from clinical trials. So let me make it really clear that it's not to replace the evidence that we have from clinical trials. The clinical phase is really to demonstrate that an intervention is safe and effective. And once we have proven that, we are ready to evaluate the intervention in a full range of patients and also under the full range of conditions in the real world. And these may not be optimal, but it is what we have to deal with in daily practice. So the slide that you see here lists some typical examples from the real world. It's about prescribers, investigators, information not available from clinical trials. It's about different patient populations. It's about different stakeholders. And actually, the denominator in this slide is heterogeneity. We have varying physicians, patients, and stakeholder needs in the real world that are all of interest. So moving on to the next slide. So with the heterogeneity in subjects and questions, we have a broad range of approaches. So here you can see on the slide a spectrum of designs and data sources. So some terminology on the slide, you can see on the left and right on the top, internal validity and external validity. Internal validity, which is really the direct comparison within a clinical trial, and external validity, which means how is the intervention behaving in the real world. You also see efficacy versus effectiveness, and it's very similar, the terms, but the difference is important. So efficacy really means, okay, what is the effect of a new intervention compared to what we already have? It could be no intervention or a standard of care, but what is really the difference if we apply a new method? Effectiveness is the same, but it's also taking into account all the other variations that come along with a new intervention. And this is really where epidemiology comes in, because in the real world, we do not have the luxury as a researcher to have just one variable that is changing, and that can be compared with a reference, and that allows us to draw conclusions about causality. Instead, in the real world, and luckily from a patient perspective, treatments follows guidelines and happens for a reason. Depending on the patient, depending on the situation, an intervention might be beneficial or not, and may only be a burden. Another terminology on this slide is the controls versus the real world. Controls in a clinical trial where we exactly know what is different in one group versus another. And then we have finally at the bottom, the interventional versus the non-interventional, which is the same as observational research. So getting back to all the terminology in the following question. Moving on to the next slide. It's kind of a repetition, what was already there, but it really nicely summarizes the left and right ends of the spectrum of the previous slide. You can see the interventional randomized controlled trial on the left, with really robust data, single sources, and really the evidence that we need to prove that an intervention is safe and effective. And on the right hand, we have the observational real-world studies with more data, multiple sources, a really broad population that can be included, and also multiple hypotheses and multiple questions that may be of interest. So moving to the next one. Remember that at the beginning, I mentioned heterogeneity, which actually also defines real-world evidence and real-world studies. So the heterogeneity is not only in the patients and study population, but also in the stakeholder needs. And this is important when we think about the design of the study. You can see here that identifying the purpose of real-world evidence is critical to research question development. And I will get to the formulation of the research question later. But before we formulate any question, we need to consider who is looking for an answer, because this drives the population of interest and also the data that we need to collect. So one thing, so as a side step to keep in mind when we do real-world studies, particularly if we are doing observational studies, is that we are not intervening in clinical practice. It means that there is no direct patient benefit of participating in a study because their treatment doesn't depend on participating in that study. So we have patients who are dealing with their disease or condition, and we have physicians who are dealing with a workload and having the care of their patients really at the top of their priorities. We need to make study participation as easy as we can. You may hear us talking about collecting data that is a need to have, see how we can avoid a nice to have that may actually be a hurdle to participation in a study. And as an epidemiologist, I'm looking at the patient level, looking at the intended populations for the study, and my role is actually to see how can we make it as easy as possible to maximize enrollment and minimize the risk of selection bias when only a specific group of patients is interested or doesn't, is not hurdled in any way by participating in the study. So here, from the following question in Michelle, in your section, we have seen the different stakeholders. I checked in the chat just now before this section, and actually the largest group answered that you were looking to generate evidence for all of the above, so multiple stakeholders. So on this slide, we have the regulatory, we have the payer, and we have any other stakeholders that might be in need of answering a research question. So let's see, moving on to the next slide. There's some theory on this slide. I promised you to walk you through some methodology theory. So here, actually the title of this slide is data collection, but it should be data and design options, because it's really about those two aspects. They are related, but I put them in separate boxes here. So to start with the design, so remember that we have prospective and retrospective research. So prospective, we are, let's say, looking into the future. We are at the start of an intervention. A randomized clinical trial is always prospective because we define the intervention, assign actually the intervention, and then monitor what happens in the future. Same for a prospective observational study. It is a cohort study where we follow two cohorts and compare their outcomes. The retrospective, and I will get to the cross-sectional later, is actually could also be a cohort study, but with a difference that we designed a study after the outcomes have already occurred. And the index date, the starting date, is in the past. It can be a cohort study. It can also be a case control study where we create our groups not based on the intervention or exposure, but where we select our groups and define our groups based on the outcome. Retrospective is always observational because we are not able to intervene in the past. And then finally, we have a cross-sectional, which is a single point in time where we observe what is the status of a specific population. So this is always observational as well. And then some terminology about data collection. So with primary data collection and secondary data collection. So at the beginning, one of the options in the design was a database study. And a database study is actually not a design option, but more a data collection option. It means that we are using data readily available in a database. So in general, this is secondary data, and it means that we are not the primary users of the data, but that we are using data that was already collected for another purpose. And the other purpose is really relevant if we consider this study design, because it could be that our need to have variables are just a nice to have in the database that's already existing. And it may impact the completeness and maybe also the validity of that data. Secondary data since, let's say, 20 years, the healthcare has been become more and more digital. We have huge amounts of data available in electronic format. So whenever we go to the physician, whenever we go to a pharmacy, there is a computer in which our information is available, and that information can be used to learn and to do real-world studies. So electronic health records, it can also be claimed, and we are also seeing more and more research based on social media, and with the increased use of wearables like Fitbit trackers, we can also use data from digital health. So there's a lot of exciting data science options for secondary data, where we have to keep in mind that the data is not collected for the research purpose, but for another purpose. And then back to the top, primary data collection, we are collecting data specifically for the study, which happens in a clinical trial, but also in observational studies. And this is collected by means of case report forms, CRF, but can also be collected by questionnaires and surveys. Let's move on to the next slide. If there are no questions in between, just warn me when anybody raises his or her hand. Yes, so here we can see that the typical data core design options. So again, on the left, the randomized control trials, and on the right, the retrospective research. This slide gives a summary of some features, advantages, and limitations. So you will receive the slide deck after the workshop, which allows you to read and recap the different elements. So the title of the slide is really to apply the right data, design, and approach for a given study question. I think we can move on to the next slide. Yeah, so here actually is the data consideration. That should be the title of one of the previous slides. So it's a lot of text. I'll walk you through it. And important here in the blue and the green, you can see the relevance and reliability of the data that we are collecting. So relevance means that the data should adequately address the applicable regulatory question. And this is focused on regulatory, but it could be also any other stakeholder. We need to make sure that we have sufficient detail. For example, a device may come with a serial number. We also need to make sure it's kind of obvious, but it's really important before we design a study and when we formulate a research question that we have access to the data, or that we are able to collect the data that has the detail that we need to answer the research. Let's have a look. It's a lot of text on this slide. So apart from the adequate, the data that's adequate in terms of the detail, we all also have to consider the clinical and scientific considerations, which means is the population representative of the population that we do need an answer on? Can we generalize the results from the study to a broader population, and is that a population of interest? It could be regional or national or international. It could also be a level of severity of the patients of interest. Are we looking at the, for example, if we're doing a study in an academic setting, will our results be generalizable to the full patient population? For example, those who never reach the academic setting but are treated in primary care, depending on the indication, of course. Let's see. Yeah, so the relevance, it could be that we do not have the detail in one data source, but we might complement the data with linkers or supplementation from other data sources. And I will get to some options later in this presentation. Reliability, of course, we need to make sure that the data is reliable. So what are considerations around reliability of the data that's collected? The timing, we need to make sure that we have a study plan, a study protocol, before we start collecting the data, that we don't design the study depending on what is available, but we do it the other way around to avoid bias. We need to standardize data dictionaries and our case report forms, and we need to make sure that we have the resources to perform the study. So why do I mention this? It's to avoid the misperception that the scrutiny of real-world observational studies is different from clinical trials. So yes, we are working with approved interventions that are proven safe and effective from the clinical setting, but it's as important to have a rigid study design and quality control. You can see it there under the data assurance to make sure that the conclusions that are drawn from the study are valid. And this is why we included this section. So on to the next slide, I have two more slides with a bit of theory. So here you can see, if you move to the next slide, Brenda, the PICO approach. So for those of you, you might or might not be familiar with the PICO approach. It's a really nice and structured way to formulate a research question. And if we do it well, we have the basis of a study protocol. So the P stands for the study population. The I is for the intervention, which could be in more observational language. It could be exposure. The C is for a comparison, the O is for outcome, and T is for time or type. And sometimes we see the PICO without the T. And in the gray box at the bottom, you can see how we can formulate a research question among population X. What is the effect of intervention X on the outcome X compared with the relevant reference during a specific time. Again, this might seem obvious, but it's really, really handy to formulate your research question. Whenever, you know, as an epidemiologist, I see a lot of research questions coming in every day. And I always start with just this little practice, formulate the PICO. Is it clear what is the population of interest? Is it clear what is the exposure or intervention of interest, and what are you comparing with? Sometimes there might not be a direct comparison. Studies may be single arm, where we are just monitoring an intervention and the effectiveness in the real world. But implicitly, there's always a comparison with what we know from literature or what we know from an external observer. So if you're able to answer all of these questions, to fill all the boxes, you have a complete research question, and you know where to look for the data to start answering the research question. So if we move to the next slide, it's another PICO slide with just more detail, playing with the different elements of the PICO tool. And here you can see the P could be population, people, participants, and intervention could be exposure, but could also be characteristic, prognostic factor. So really the question is, what defines the index group? What are we interested in? And here again, the comparison. And another term that is really useful is the counterfactual. We are always looking for, you know, the effect of a new intervention. We can monitor it, but actually the basic question is always, what if the exposure wasn't there? What would have happened? And this situation might not be available in the real world, but it's always what we are comparing with. Let's see, so time, yes, at a relevant period. And this is specifically important if we're talking about retrospective research. A database study with, let's say, 20 years of data might be tempting to execute because the data is already available. We don't need a long time to run the study. Results may be quickly available, which might also reduce the cost. But are we collecting relevant evidence from that's still applicable to 2022 today? Because clinical care might have changed, guidelines might have changed, and patients might have changed in the meantime. So moving to the next slide. There is one, yeah, it's actually the favorite terminology, bias and confounding. It's something that we have to deal with in the real world. So remember at the beginning, I mentioned that we are lucky that clinical practice is guided by guidelines and informed decisions. But it might make it more complicated to draw conclusions from a real world study. So as a recap, bias and confounding are often mentioned just in one breath, like I'm doing now, but they are different concepts. So bias creates an association that is actually not true. It could be due to selection bias, when patients participating in the study are more healthier than general, or are treated in a specific center that is not representative of the whole patient population, for example. It could also be that we have information bias. One of my favorite examples is that, for example, a patient weight collected in a GP setting is probably biased towards patients that have issues with their weight. So the more heavy patients will have more frequent measurements of their weight and BMI. So the average that you will find in any given database is not the average that is in that actual population. Confounding describes an association that is true, but potentially misleading. It's not causal. And in pharmacoepidemiology, but also in device epidemiology, this is nearly always present because there's a reason for receiving a certain treatment. Imagine that we have a new treatment that is better, more effective than the standard of care, but is also more expensive. And it could be that it is given to patients who have more severe disease. So if you compare the population on the standard of care by the population receiving the new treatment, you are comparing the standard of care with the new treatment, but you're also comparing patients who are doing relatively well with patients who are more severe in their condition, which could lead to worse outcomes in the intervention group compared to the standard of care group, which is not due to the device, but it's actually due to the underlying conditions of the patients. And this is confounding by indication. There is not much that we can do about it because we are not intervening in clinical care. But here we really have to turn to the statistics to adjust for the baseline differences. So we have propensity scoring or other methods for adjustment. So let me move on to the next slide, where here, again, you can see the spectrum, and we try to be consistent. We have the clinical trials on the left and in blue, and the purely observational work on the right and in green. And here, this is where it gets exciting. So within this spectrum, we have the primary and secondary, but in the middle, we have a lot of options to play with the different design options and the different data options. So I don't know how many minutes I have left. I think I have a few. So a few options that we can do to play. With the options that we have is pragmatic randomization, a pragmatic trial, and I have two examples in my two final slides. It's really a randomized clinical trial in clinical practice, which means that we are intervening with the treatment, and we can do that if we are when two treatments are comparable, but when we want to study this any further. So patients are randomized and are followed up in usual care. So it means that it's open label. We allow patients to behave differently or physicians to behave differently depending on the intervention that they receive, because this is what happens in the real world. Patients and physicians know the treatment that is received, so they act on it. So this is a pragmatic randomized trial. We can also, the augment box that we see there is that we can, it's similar to enrich. The data that we are collecting might be incomplete or not quite meet the demands of the study question. So with the data available, for example, in electronic health records, we might do a lot of the data collection by this automated method, but it could be that we are adding in or plugging in additional data collections, such as patient-reported outcomes, physician-reported outcomes, and by linkage, we can combine data sources to do an efficient way of data collection. And I will touch on that in one of my later slides to see how it can actually be, you can gain time, but also reduce the budget of performing a study. You can also see extend. A lot of the real-world studies that we are doing are extension studies or rollover studies in which we follow patients who participated in a clinical trial in the real world without keeping the clinical trial alive, but continuing with a lighter touch for long-term safety or effectiveness follow-up. So moving to the next slide, Brenda. I have two case studies. Yes, that's it. I have two case studies for you. So the first one is a pragmatic RCT. And this study was about a new implant, and it was a spinal stabilization system, which was compared with a standard herniectomy. The primary endpoint was the relief of back pain, but as you can see on the slide, there was also a list of other study objectives that included patient experience, including disability and quality of life. And the primary outcome was really to demonstrate the superiority of the intervention compared to the standard. On the situation was that the manufacturer was looking to demonstrate the benefits with this list of multiple study objectives between the two study treatments. So what happened? The device or the intervention was approved. Patients were randomized to one or the other treatment arm, and as you can see in the blue box, there was a usual care follow-up, which means that patients were fully aware of the intervention that they received, and that also the physicians, their treating physicians, were fully aware. So the study was of scientific interest to surgeons and payers, and because there was no mandated protocol or assessments to be done during the follow-up, site burden was minimized, which made it easier for patients and physicians to participate, which makes it cost-effective and also maximizes inclusion. So the final results are published, and the quote from that is that the analysis supported superiority of the intervention over the conservative care for moderate back pain and appropriately selected patients. So this is an example of how we can perform a clinical trial in the real world and also allow patients to behave and physicians as they would in the real world. The second case study that we have selected is again a pragmatic RCT, and this is nice because this is with a digital device. So it was an asthma device, and there was an inhaler with a Bluetooth connection that gave feedback on adherence. So here you can see again a screening period in which eligibility of the patients was assessed. Then there was a change to an inhaler. And here you can see on the right, after the randomization, the difference between the groups was the use of the inhaler with feedback using an app or without feedback. So this is the usual care. And going back to the left, to the situation, the outcomes were the level of asthma control, quality of life, exacerbations, and healthcare utilization in those patients. The solution, this randomized, as a pragmatic randomized control trial, was again to minimize site burden. As you can see, the outcomes were as collected in clinical care, and a part of the intervention was really at the patient level. We call that directivation with the intervention on their smartphone. So this is called a patient-centric approach, which we apply more and more in our real-world studies. It minimizes the site burden, and on the other hand, it also increases patient engagement because they see what data is collected and they see the impact on their condition. So I think we have arrived at my final slide for today, which is a slide about efficiency. With real-world evidence, we are rewriting the rules. Again, you can see the pure primary and pure secondary data, where IQVIA is playing with all the options that we have as a data science company to tailor the study and the approach to the question at hand, with minimal burden for data collection for patients and physicians, and maximizing what we get out of the study. So this is kind of a case study that we performed some time ago, where we analyzed the portfolio of a given company, and the assessment that we did is looking at what was done in terms of studies, how could we replace this by the more novel approaches, such as pragmatic studies, enriching secondary data with primary data collection, adding external comparators to a single arm studies. How could we gain time? How can we get faster insight? And how can we reduce the cost so that any budget that we are not spending, and here you can see the 15%, that we can invest it in additional evidence generation. So the final slide in my presentation is really some reading. As I mentioned, you will get the slides after the workshop. It contains some guidance, including the links that you can click on to learn more about guidance from the FDA, principles for evaluating the quality of observational studies, developing protocols, and the ISO 14155 with Michelle. You mentioned this one as well. I don't know how many minutes I have left, but I'm happy to take any questions.
You are right on time at this point, Irene. Thank you so much for your session. Again, at this point, there's no questions. Unless anybody would like to add some questions or some comments just before we take our break, you're welcome to do so right now. Alternatively, I'd like to thank Irene, Michelle, and Sue, as well as Andrew, for your informative session so far. If there's anything else that you'd like to add, Michelle, at this point, or yourself, Andrew, you can please go ahead.
No, thank you, John. And yeah, I was just to also just thank the speakers. And I think just after the break, we'll go into our last module then of the workshop.
Perfect. Well, without further ado, then we'll take our break from now till about 12:35, 12:37 for the latest, and we'll return for the second leg of this workshop. So please enjoy your coffee or tea.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Okay, great. I'd like to welcome everyone back to the second leg of this workshop. Andrew, or if you're available, or Michelle, you're welcome to take over and introduce your next speakers. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jonathan. So yeah, I hope you're all able to grab a cup of tea or coffee or a drink and have a quick break. And this is our last session, which is actually jam-packed with really great insights into operational approaches and health economic modelling. And just kind of a little just refresher onto what we'd be covering in this session is looking at best practices in conducting real-world research, looking at different models of how you can collect data, how you can apply a patient-centric approach, and then the health economic modelling. And then we just close out is, from our perspective, how we see the evolution of how we're going to be collecting real-world evidence. So I think this may be our last polling question. So I'll just ask Jonathan if you can post it. So question to everyone, what is the #1 challenge? And we put #1 because we know there may be several challenges. What's the #1 challenge you face in conducting real world research today? Is it challenges around site recruitment and retention, patient recruitment and retention, having experienced resources in real world evidence generation, or is it the budget for these studies? So just give a couple of minutes for everyone to review the question and submit your response. So your #1 challenge today. So do we have any votes coming in? We do. And yes, so far 45% is budget, then followed by equally, interestingly, the site patient recruitment and experience resources. So hopefully during this session, and I see the numbers are even increasing now, we're up to almost 60% budget. So an important factor. So during this session, hopefully we'll be able to address some of these challenges that you're facing. So moving on to the next slide. So we covered best practice from the epidemiologic methods, and just want to start off with this slide is just talking about whatever approach you choose to generate your evidence, to collect your data. We bucketed it into the 3 core principles to apply to ensure the integrity of your study. One is the ethical approach, the second is scientific, and the third is practical. And just a few highlights of these. Ethical, of course, we always need to put patient safety first as well, that we're not exposing the patient to any potential risk in the conduct of the study. We also need to take into account the patient population we're enrolling. As Irene mentioned also, the diverse populations, the representative populations that you can enroll into these studies. So if we're collecting data on vulnerable populations, on pediatrics, on pregnant women, on elderly, always make sure also that we have the right consent in place. If you're collecting data, for example, on children enrolled into the study, maybe during the conduct of the study, they reach the age of maturity. Do you need to get a reconsent of them as an adult participating? Always ensure also patient rights and data privacy is protected, so compliance with data privacy laws, especially now we're looking at maybe the more novel approaches of collecting patient-generated data from digital biomarkers and sensors, or collecting data directly from the patient. And then last in the ethical arc is conflict of interest. And maybe just to put this into perspective, in the real world setting, you always have to be very careful in these studies that we're not in any way influencing the physician's decision to treat a patient or how they follow up on the patient. One example of a conflict of interest may be in fair market compensation. The compensation in these real world studies is lower than in your traditional clinical trial, as we're just collecting the data from healthcare that's administered in routine practice. So we should always make sure that the payment and compensation to the investigators is reflective of this, and that we're not overcompensating for this. Scientific, Irene already did an excellent job highlighting, but just to summarize the PICO equation of, you know, does your data capture the right information to answer your research question? And then from the practical perspective, just go through some of these points. Time is, when do you need the data by? Is the data required for a regulatory purpose? Is the data required for reimbursement or other objectives? Do you need to have the data in the next 12 months or longer? Because that's going to impact how you're going to collect the data, how much data is available, maybe if it's a newly launched device into the market. So what are your stakeholder needs, and can you collect that data? Also need to look at patient availability. Will you be able to follow up on the patient if needed to collect any long-term, longitudinal follow-up data? And then importantly in these studies is understanding the current treatment practice, the patient pathways. How are you going to collect the data? How are patients treated in a real-world setting? And then also the availability of data. As I mentioned, if the device is newly launched into the market, how much time will you need to go through the learning curve of the surgeons to be able to collect the data and a long-term follow-up? Or does the data already exist in medical records? Also take into account your strategic goals, that the purpose of your study is also aligned with strategic goals. And then I put it last, but definitely not least, is budget. What is the budget that you have for your study? Is there different approaches that you can also use to collect the data, to generate the data, and different budgets as well? So just a few words on the budgets if we move on to the next slide. So just have a couple of slides around study budgets. So I put it here together, just a summary of common cost drivers. They're all probably very familiar, but just to put in context for our real world studies, we need to take into account the protocol design and how complex the study is going to be. How many patients that you're going to be enrolling into the study, the number of sites, of course, these are all going to be important cost drivers. The number of countries, you have all the additional costs of setting up additional countries as well, you need to take into account. How complex will it be for managing the sites? How long will the study last for, that you need to recruit the patient, collect data on treatment and outcomes and follow-up? The size of your case record form and the complexity of data that you're going to be capturing in it, and data cleaning methodology. So let me just talk a little bit more on these elements as well, just to put into perspective of cost. So if we move on to the next slide. So I've kind of grouped here into buckets that you have also as a reference, the cost driver around these different categories. If we look at study design, if, you know, the more cost effective option should be your observational design, following up unusual care, limited endpoints and burden. When we look at site startup, of course, if you need to do site initiation visits for all of your sites, that's going to be more costly than doing remote or maybe hybrid. And also in the new updated ISO 14155, and they also allow for risk-based monitoring. So this also allows you now to move to doing initiation visits remotely, or maybe having a hybrid where sites have experience. We also need to take into account the burden on sites as well. We see more and more now sites are preferring to have remote visits, especially with the COVID pandemic as well. And we need to take into account budget around recruitment. So if this is you know, a rare condition or a more prevalent condition, that will impact also budget as well. And then also the monitoring. So also tied into the ISO standards as well, we can do risk-based monitoring. So we don't need to be, especially in a real world study, we don't need to be out monitoring 100%, doing 100% source data verification. So maybe we can have a hybrid model, and in some cases, depending on the study, we can do fully remote, and this will also reduce cost of your study. Data collection and cleaning, also taking into account the number of variables being collected. And we'll be addressing this a little bit more in data quality as well, is looking at what's your research question, the endpoints you're collecting. Sometimes a little bit tempting, maybe it's a real world study, let's collect a little bit more data, could be interesting, we're not quite sure what we do with it. So we always need to stay focused on what's the research question and collecting the data for that, because that also has a budget impact as well. And then also the data analysis. Many of the observational studies can use the more, if I can say, simple from the biostatistical methods, but more descriptive analysis, not applying a complex multivariate analysis as well. So moving into the real world studies, if we do go by the more simple observational studies with risk-based monitoring, limited data variables as well, collecting real world data, this should always be a step to consider to manage budget in these studies. So moving on to the next slide is, I just wanted to highlight a little bit what Irene was doing in her section, but maybe more from a practical operational perspective, is taking side by side 3 different study types, looking at benefits and limitations of them. And then I'll go into a case study on the last one on the survey. Again, this is the more optimal, cost-effective approach. I just want to highlight this type of a survey. So database studies, this is existing data, an existing database that you can go and collect this data. Benefits of this is the data is already there, the outcomes have been collected. So we say it's more representative of your real world population. But the challenge sometimes with these studies is not all databases have all the data that you want, can be limited to diseases and collecting data on the outcomes that you want. I think we're seeing, as more and more now industry is moving more to the use of real world evidence, we're getting better, relevant and reliable data that we can use from existing databases. The retrospective studies are your traditional chart abstraction study. You can see already, I think we had one of the earlier pollings, there were already around 20% have experience in these studies or interested in them. And these are your very straightforward studies is, you can go to the site and collect data. The outcome has already occurred and collect data from medical records. And we're also looking at more novel approaches where this data can be pulled through connectivity into electronic medical records. Some of the challenges of these studies may be, it could be less representative of your broader population, especially if you need any form of consent. If the patient has already been treated, it may not always be feasible to collect consent if they're no longer following up with their healthcare provider. So the last is a survey. These are very simple, surveys, can be primary research surveys. And what's interesting about these more and more we're seeing, you can collect data that's often even not included in the patient medical records. They're quick, they're easy to set up, and we just also need to look at it of the data that you can get from these studies. Some of the challenges are, and again, it'll depend on your research objective, is it mightn't always be representative. We do recommend is when you're doing these surveys, is get representative surgeons and physicians participating in the survey. And also, if you're planning to publish from a survey, always look to see will it be accepted by the peer-reviewed journals. The next slide is this case study. Just wanted to show you again the simplicity of the surveys and how we have used it. So this is one with one of our platforms, but this can be used. Many platforms, are available for these surveys. So the manufacturer wanted to collect data from physicians about their experience with newly launched devices. They actually also wanted to use the data to satisfy the needs of a notified body in the EU under the new medical medical device regulation. So they wanted to collect information on the use of the device and capture real world data from the physician's experience. Again, as I mentioned, this is often data that's not available in medical records, and this is important also for your prescribing community of healthcare providers. And also the sponsor wanted to be able to have access to the data. They were planning to roll it out in one country when the product launched, in another country when it launched, with ongoing access to the data. So you can set up very simple, if you design it well, very simple questionnaires to collect information, aggregate information from the physicians on their decision to use their device, their feedback on the use of the device, the benefits of using the device, or any feedback on what can be done to also improve the device as well. And more we're looking at using these survey data to support in regulatory decision making, in pre-market, in post-market, and also using the data, of course, to communicate to your stakeholders, to your providers, and to the payers as well. So I'm going to hand over to Brenda, who will talk a little bit about, when we're looking at the practical approaches, the different site approaches and different approaches to be able to collect data.
Thank you, Michelle. So on this slide, in real world studies in general, there are three main approaches to be able to collect your data. So we have the more traditional site-based approach, the hybrid model in the middle, which is a combination of both the site-based and the direct-to-patient approach. And then on the right, we have your pure sort of decentralized direct-to-patient approach. And so depending on your study objective and patient journey, all can apply. So it's really important to consider where the data is coming from. So is the data coming from the site or the patient? And then you can decide which is the optimal approach to use. So in this table here, there are some key considerations for each approach that you have as a reference. And I'll just pull out some highlights from the table here. So for the site-based approach, this is the more traditional approach, as I mentioned, where you would enroll the site and they would enroll the patient and do the follow-up. You will typically require ethics committee approval, regulatory requirements will need to be met, data will be collected by the site staff, and traditionally a risk-based monitoring approach is commonly used. And typically these are most expensive out of the three delivery approaches. Then you have in the middle the hybrid model. So this is where you have a site, but you can have an element of the study where you would collect the data directly from the patient. So you have a combination here of both the site and the direct-to-patient approaches that I mentioned. And the level to which each approach plays in will really depend on which outcomes you're looking to collect. And then finally, you have the more novel sort of emerging area of direct-to-patient and decentralized virtual type trials and studies. So, and here you don't have a site per se, but you would go back to the treating physician to validate any events as well. So this is usually observational in nature and sometimes low interventional studies where the data is collected directly from the patient. Ethics and regulatory requirements will vary from country to country and sometimes even undefined in some countries. Also, there's an increasing digital component via integrated platforms and connected devices, and data collection and remote monitoring are you know, done digitally as well and remotely. So these are typically of a lower cost than your traditional site-based approach. And on to the next slide, just to really focus on that first pillar around site-based approaches. And a potential challenges that we have with site-based models and approaches are that you may face, site engagement and retention challenges. So here are a few pointers that we have put together to really draw out how we can address some of those challenges, such as resource capacity, investigator interest, and competing studies as well. So first of all, it's really important to plan and implement some of these strategies early on. So these include reducing the burden on sites with a fit for purpose design of the study. So to really avoid that over collection of data. And of course, implementing a direct-to-patient approach, including e-consent and electronic patient-reported outcomes wherever possible. We also need to engage sites and investigators in the long term. And a couple of sort of suggestions here are that we could anticipate any site personnel changes, having efficient study tools in place, and really being able to support the investigators at the site with their own objectives, so their scientific objectives and potentially also their publication strategies. And as we move into the more hybrid model, where we're having elements of decentralized and direct-to-patient modules come into play, I would say that, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we're increasingly seeing a shift to the more decentralized direct-to-patient approaches. And this has really been enabled by our connectivity to the patients via digital health. So here I mean sort of the access that the patients have to mobile apps, wearables, and just overall connectivity to the patient. So this has really sort of moved the patients, the study participants, away from the need for a site-based approach towards the more decentralized, remote or home-based framework. And it's really great news for real-world evidence studies, because a lot of the requirements for these studies can be done in the home setting. So it's kind of it fits very, very well with real-world evidence studies. There are still some study designs that will require a few elements of in-person contact, but those barriers are becoming minimal with the ever-changing technological advancements and landscapes. And as regulators find ways to keep patients connected to the healthcare systems around the globe, we will only see that shift increasing towards the right. Importantly, though, there is the flexibility to have modular options. So here, this is why we have the multiple layers here, that we can scale up and down depending on your research objective. So next, I wanted to just give you an example, or to bring it to life, of a hybrid model of a study which really demonstrates the evidence generation on long-term patient outcomes. This was focused on post-market clinical follow-up, and it really nicely highlights the hybrid model of site-based with a direct-to-patient element, where we're able to really reduce the site burden and also engage the patient effectively. So the sponsor here wanted to run a 10-year study with patient follow-up for over 2 years. And one of the main challenges they were facing was that the specialists were having difficulty reaching out, reaching the patients post-surgery, when these patients didn't really need to, or have the need to, go back to the site for a follow-up visit. Also, it would have been a burden for the sites to keep the study open for the full 10-year duration. And there was also concerns that there would be potential physician bias when reporting patient outcomes. So we came up with a really nice solution here. So patients were enrolled at the site prior to the surgery. They had their post-op visit at the site, and then after that, every 6 months, they were followed up directly to collect their patient-reported outcomes and safety variables. And all of this was direct-to-patient contact, and it was compliant with data privacy legislations. And if there was a potential safety event triggered from the collection of these PROs and the safety questionnaires, there would be a follow-up directly with the site. And the result was that we were able to collect consistent, high-quality data in a secure database, and we're really able to reduce that site burden with the direct-to-patient follow-up. And the patients were really able to rate their own outcomes directly without that physician bias that I mentioned earlier. Also, we had a really fast and efficient process for the identification of possible SAEs, and that really allowed us to ensure timely follow-up. It was a really cost-effective solution, and the data was ultimately used to support post-market clinical follow-up requirements. And what's really nice was that the results were consequently published, and there was value messaging for key stakeholders from this study. Okay, so as I mentioned, this new I just wanted to highlight here that digital tools in general is playing a huge part now in being a key enabler for patient centricity to really continue that shift away from the traditional healthcare landscape. And increasingly now we're seeing these digital tools enabling us to collect and generate patient-generated health data. And we can see a really interesting quote here on the right. But we're really seeing that shift from the more traditional types of data collection to the more digitally enabled patient-generated health data. I spoke about site recruitment and retention. Here I want to shift gears to more of that direct-to-patient approach, where we're able to really focus on patient-centric approaches to recruit and retain the patient. So whatever study approach you choose, it comes back to the patient. So it's really important to have a patient-centric approach built around all of these elements, including recruitment, retention, and training. So in terms of recruitment, well, as you've just seen, one of the key strategies to keeping a patient engaged is to engage them early in protocol design for them to better commit to participating in the study. On to retention studies, strategies, you may look at building, as I mentioned, a hybrid direct-to-patient outreach to really stay connected with the patient. And finally, in terms of support, patients may have questions and issues, so really having that patient-level support through perhaps a help desk or a call center and training materials is really, really important as well. And then my final slide is another case study where here we were supporting physicians in managing healthcare costs and preventing readmissions after they had had surgery using that patient-generated health data that I mentioned. So here we were collecting behavioral data directly from the patient, and the data was really monitoring their daily activity in terms of the number of steps they were taking post hip or knee replacement surgery. And all of this data was collected passively and directly from the patient's wearable activity tracker in the home setting. And then with the platform, we were able to efficiently process all of this wearable data and convert this into patient mobility curves. So a really nice example of how we can use patient-generated health data to really generate real-world evidence as well. Okay, so I've come to the end of the patient centricity section, and I'll now be handing over to Dr. Saurabh Kumar, who will be talking to us about health economic modeling. Over to you, Dr. Saurabh.
Yeah, thank you, Brinda. Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Saurabh. So I'll just take you through a brief about the health economics. The the poll that we did before this session highlighted one thing about the major thing that concerns is the budget. And this all relates to the budget part of it, that how do we budget the cost, how we budget the economics around the around designing of the devices as well as the cost of the device. So before we dive into the more details, what exactly is health economics? So it is basically compares the value of one therapy with another. So it just sees which therapy is better than the other one. So it's more of a medical device, which medical device is better than the other one, whether it is a catheter or a pacemaker, which is a better one, and not only from a cost perspective. Uh, that's one part of it, but what kind of risk, the benefits, the outcomes that come out of it, does that justify the cost of a certain device which has been used? Why we need it? Because the healthcare costs are increasing and these have to be allocated appropriately. So the objective of doing a health economic study is to actually allocate budgets to the interventions where we can get a maximum gain per unit of the money, which is actually a value. So in a short term, I would say what value am I deriving out of a particular device is what constitutes in health economics. If you can move to next slide, Brinda. Sure, thank you. So what do we consider in health economic when we are doing these health economic evaluations? So there are three main aspects. One is the cost, the perspective, and the outcome. So when I talk about the cost, it means it may be a direct cost, which can be because of the doctors, which are the medical cost, the device cost. That's something which will come as a direct cost. Indirect cost may be the side effects which may happen because of the device insertion, or some untoward effects which happen, or the additional therapies which have to be added. They may come as an indirect cost. The intangible cost, which may be because of patient has to move around, patient has to leave his day job. So all these things come as the cost. Then is the perspective. Whose perspective am I talking about? Is it the payer perspective? Because the payer would be looking at from a different basis. The payer would be looking at how much is my entire budget for the entire healthcare portfolio or the healthcare budget, and then how much can I allocate for a particular therapy or a particular device for a particular disease. And as a provider perspective, a doctor or a hospital sector or the hospital would be looking at how much money should I be allocating for a particular device as compared to other devices, what kind of a benefit or what kind of a value it brings to my patients, a particular device brings in. Then the patient perspective, very understandable that what value a patient derives of it. The device may be uh, of millions, but if the value in terms of outcomes is not that much, the patient may not be appreciating the effort or the impact that the device brings in. Societal perspective, what impact a particular device has it on the society. So it's more about how good it is, how much beneficial it is for the entire society, how much budget it takes in. So that's the perspective. And last but not the least is the outcome, which has got three components. Again, clinical, what kind of a clinical benefit it provides. So if I'm putting in a pacemaker, how much heart failures or heart cardiac related effects I'm able to actually reduce. Economic, how much money I've been able to save by using a particular intervention from a device perspective. And then the humanistic is about how better I am able to provide a quality of life to the society. How good a patient with a catheter or with a pacemaker is able to do his or her jobs on a daily basis and contribute to the society as well as to his or her health. That something comes in the humanistic. So whenever we are doing these health economic evaluations, these all three things may play major role in deciding what kind of evaluation I need to do, what kind of an outcome am I looking, and what kind of a narrative that I need to develop. Because a payer would be looking from a different perspective, providers separately, and they will be looking at different costs as well as they will look asking for different outcomes. Next slide, please. So like I said, there are different perspectives, and for each each combination of the combination permutations of the perspectives, you can have different kind of health economic analysis. So there can be partial economic evaluations, there can be full economic evaluations. The partial evaluations can be cost consequence analysis, cost outcome analysis, cost of illness. In the full, it's cost minimization analysis, cost benefit, cost effectiveness, cost utility, and budget impact. Next slide has got the details to it, details of these analysis. If you can move to next slide, Brinda. So I'll not go in the detail of all these, but what I want to highlight is that each of these have got a different, I would say, usage. So, and have got their own advantage and limitations. So if I see from a cost, the partial ones, which are like cost of illness or the cost consequence analysis or a cost consequence analysis, there I'm just looking at the cost of the therapy. I'm not looking at comparing it with others. I'm just looking, if I do a certain intervention, what is the impact of it, right? So that's where it comes in. And in these kind of analysis, I'm not able to compare it with another therapy. So I just mean a particular pacemaker intervention costs, say, $1 million, but that's all. I mean, do I have $1 million in my budget? And can I do that? But I'm not comparing it with a pacemaker B, which may be having a $500,000 kind of evaluation, and then I look at it. So these are all different kind of evaluations which are done. If you can move to the next slide. Another is the cost effectiveness analysis, where again it's a most common one which is used when we have to do a full analysis to see how these therapies compare with each other, what kind of a benefit do they bring in from a value perspective, and what kind of queries are we able to actually, I would say, save when we are using different therapies from a use perspective.
I think Saurabh, can you hear us? Looks like he's on mute. Let's just give another, just to see if he's able to connect back. I think we have him back. Otherwise, we can move ahead and then come back to his session. Oh, we have you back.
Sorry. So, there's some problem with the just is it fine now?
There's some background echo, Dr. Saurabh. So maybe what I can recommend in the interest of time is, Brenda, if we just go to the slide on data quality.
Okay
I
now?
think we are back. Yes. Can you hear us, Dr. Saurabh?
Sorry, yes, I can move ahead and then
we wait and see. Apologies for this. As we're all aware, the challenges of working from home at the moment. Go back one. Oh, we can hear you back.
Sorry.
Fantastic. Okay, so we can go back to your slide.
Yep. So,
thank you.
No problem. Apologies for the break.
Sorry.
Yes. Yeah, this was the slide. So when we are comparing these two kind of therapies, when we are looking at cost effective analysis, I was on that. So this is like comparing the QALYs, and what we usually do in this is an extensive process where we look at how much incremental benefit is coming in.
And similarly, you have this cost benefit and cost utility budget impact. I'll not go into detail, but on the next slide, I will just has a guideline that when is to be used, which kind of evaluation is to be used and when. So when you have both the cost and outcomes that have to be assessed, and there are more than two alternatives, then you do a kind of a full evaluation, which is like cost consequences analysis, cost minimization, or cost effectiveness. However, when it's more of either of the cost or the outcome is to be evaluated, and you have got the comparison is not between two therapies, then you do the partial evaluations. So this guidance can act as an easy guideline to decide which evaluation is to be done when we are comparing two interventions from a device perspective. If you can move to the next slide, please. So as such, like I mentioned, health economics is an extensive process, but there are certain principles which needs to be taken care of when we are doing these analyses. First is about the time horizon. So what time horizon am I looking at? Is it at a very short period, maybe 6 months, or is it at long period of a year or 2 years or 5 years? So that's something which needs to be taken care of when we are designing an economic model. Discounting is about how much is more of a mathematical procedure where we look at how we are discounting the future costs and how we are doing the outcome analysis. And lastly, the sensitivity, because when we are looking at the cost, there are multiple factors which are going to impact. So how does the impact factors can be the location, the type of patients, the type of intervention or the device that we are using. So it all depends how much impact these things have on the outcome of the economic modeling. Because then when we are presenting a report to a particular stakeholder, we have to clearly identify that these are the concerns or these are the areas which are sensitive, and how we tackle those issues during working with the model. If you go to the next slide. So the slides that I presented till now were more of a generalistic that I used across and worked across the devices and therapy areas. Now, what does the status of health economic modeling for the medtech devices? So till now, the need for, the guidelines have not been generated much for the medical devices, and they have been clubbed with the medicines. But given the fact that now new devices are coming in the market, new interventions are coming up, it's involving the AI, it's involving the new technology. There has been a trend where there is a ask to have a separate guidelines for the HE modeling for the devices perspective. So if you see, this was a paper which was presented where they said that where they looked at in the European geography, how much is the penetration of, or how much importance a medical device is given while designing the guidelines. So if you see in the South Africa area, it is more of a structure, it's part of the structure that they have it, but not completely as a separate guideline. And if you see on the pie chart, majority of the geographies still do not have it as a separate guideline. It may be as a part of the general guidelines, or they may not be there. However, like I said, now more and more regulators and more providers, they are asking for such kind of studies so as to manage their budgets and look at how they can efficiently provide value to the patients. If you can move to the next slide. So what are the challenges that come when we are doing an economic analysis for the medical devices? First and foremost is the low evidence, because limited data and limited studies. Then is about the learning curve. So it takes a time for people to understand a device and its usage, and it differs in different settings. For a medicine, it's same across. So the person just have to take a medicine and that's all. But when it comes to a device, there is a learning curve, and the learning curve differs by level, by setting, by location. So that comes into a challenge that how I model that. Then is about the diversity, because there are multiple types of medical devices which will exist. So how do I actually bring apples to apple comparison? Incremental innovation, which keeps on happening. So how do I model that? Dynamic pricing as per the different features that may exist in a medical device. Transferability, how can I transfer one knowledge or one kind of a data that I have captured or a study that I've captured from one type of device to another one. And then also the organization impact, because I'll have to train the people. I'll have to make changes to the organization because, for example, if I'm setting up a new CT scan or an MRI, there I may not be able to put it in an existing infrastructure, and I may have to make some changes to the infrastructure. So that also needs to be budgeted into the cost. So these are some challenges which are faced when working with the medical device health economic modeling. If you can move to the next slide. I know how much time I have. I'll take this as a last one then. So what are the actionable recommendations which have been given in this paper? First and foremost is you have to look at what is going to be the medical device impact on it. So whether the impact will be transient, it may be less than 1 month, which may be say a catheter or a cannula, or it's a short term, which may be more than 1 month or a year. So that would give us how do I characterize the perspective, the timeline, and the type of economic analysis I need to do. Then is the categorization. So another thing is whether my device is a therapeutic, whether my device is diagnostic, whether it is an implanted one or it is just used as it is. That also helps in defining what kind of endpoints I need to look at. Because for a diagnostic, my endpoint would be quite different about how relevant or how sensitive or how specific a test is and how much benefit I'm able to get it. Therapeutic maybe on a long term. So those things define what should be my endpoint. When it comes to clinical evidence, the data is not that much, but what has been said is that at the early stage of the development, it is preferred that we do an economic analysis, and the rationale for it is that if we do see that there is going to be a less benefit, we can make those tweaks at the early stage of it, which may be an easier task than doing it once it is in the market. Also, when we are designing a medical device, it's very important to see how much organizational impact it would have. If I'm making a change to an MRI machine, which may be a substantial, then the organizations may have to make a change into their infrastructure, which may again be a challenge and lead to a cost inclusion into the HE modeling that may be done. Last but not the least, the learning curve. So if it is completely different from what the existing technology is, and it requires a lot of learning by the different people who are going to operate it, then also that creates a trouble, because that would be like that may cause a problem from a cost perspective. So we need to look at what all things we need to include, and then design as per these guidelines which have been mentioned in the paper. If you move to the next slide, please. So when it comes to the evaluations, like I mentioned in my previous slides, the perspective usually taken to be a country specific. What this means is that if we are in South Africa, the data has to be from South Africa geography or nearby geographies or geographies which are closer to the demographics and the economics of the particular country. And if it is only for the hospital, then the hospital and payer perspective has to be taken up. Discount rate, like I mentioned, it's usually 3 to 5%, or if there is a specific country guidelines. Analysis methods. So basically for the short terms, it's CEA or BIM, and for long term, it's cost utility analysis. There are certain questionnaires which are mentioned. So these are humanistic outcomes which we look at. So the MedTech questionnaire and the EQ5D and SF60 questionnaires are to be considered. For the medical devices, the time horizon which is usually considered is transient is 3 years, short term is 5 years, and when it is long term, it's around 10 years. So the diagnostic devices where it's more of a touch and go kind of a situation. We look at how much retesting time is there and what kind of an impact it would have on the disease. that needs to be taken up, the time period between that. And then sensitivity analysis, we have been talking in the past that what would be the learning curve effect, what would be the organizational effect, and what would be the potential future changes that would happen in the past. So all those things need to be taken care of. So I think that's all from my side. I'll skip this case study in the interest of time. This is just the steps which needs to be taken up when we are doing a health economic evaluation. So that's all from my side. Sorry for the interruption. Back to you, Michelle.
Thank you. Such an interesting topic for us. So we just have a few minutes left, and I just want to close out in this session just with a couple of slides. One is, I mean, the final is, as whatever data you're generating, you always just need to underpin quality around this. We've highlighted here, and we'll be providing, of course, the slides, is just to be aware of challenges in collecting real world data, from missing source data, or maybe the data is in the source, it doesn't make it into the CRF, or it makes it into the CRF, but there's poor quality. And there's steps you can take to mitigate that and proactively address it during your study. So you have a 10-point guide here, but ultimately to say is develop a case report form that is simple, minimizes burden, focus on your research question, and have a data management plan in place. So then just the final slide is, just before we go into the closing, is what we've been seeing within IQVIA. We've been looking at how real world evidence is evolving, and we've really seen COVID-19 has really been an inflection point, taking into account is how we can generate evidence using technology and minimizing burden on sites and on patients. And we've seen the whole process now evolving is we're looking at more novel approaches to collect the data through hybrid or direct to patient, more innovative study designs as well, and using even cloud-based systems to develop evidence platforms. This is going to continue to evolve over the coming years, and we'll even be looking at how we can directly pull the data from the medical records and analyze that directly and feed it back to the healthcare providers. And it's expected that over time, when we become more efficient in these methods, that the cost of collecting this data, using the data, the costs will go down with the more access to data as well. So we hope we found this useful for you, for your business, for your strategies as well, understanding a little bit more on the market. We set out with these goals, understanding the value of real world evidence, epidemiologic methods, regulatory standards, operational methods, health economic modeling, and how you can apply quality to your data as well. So with that, I'm just going to hand over to Andrew just to do the final close out, and then back to Jonathan as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And thanks to all the speakers as well, Dr. Saurabh, Brenda, Sue, Irene, and again, thanks to the SAMED team for hosting us today and giving us this honor and privilege to be able to engage your members on such a critical topic for the devices industry. Our contact details are up on the final page. As Michelle said, this deck will be disseminated to you guys via Caroline. I'm not too sure when that'll go out. I suppose as soon as we can get that to Caroline, probably today or tomorrow, you guys will have a copy of both the recording and the deck as well. So feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions, concerns, or comments, or even if you just like to have a conversation with us about your market access strategy or any other questions. So thanks once again to the SAMED team. Jonathan, thanks for being a great host. So back to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's been an absolute pleasure. I think if there are no further questions or comments from the floor, we'd really like to thank Andrew and your team as well from IQVIA for a very comprehensive and informative presentation today. I believe today's presentation has really shown us the importance of real world data and real world evidence, as it relates to research, and particularly in today's age and the age of the 4IR, the data age and the digital age. I think we were surrounded by so many new medical technologies being brought to a market at a rapid pace, how do we move beyond the hype of truly assess the value add to the patient, as well as the impact on the economics. And I think in this arena, in this context, pre and post market surveillance becomes so important, especially when we take a patient-centric approach from the onset of the development or manufacturing of these devices, and also in particular how this relates to value-based healthcare reimbursement. So we really want to thank you for this informative session, and to all the subject matter experts. We really appreciate your sentiments and comments. And we hope that those who did attend today have gained some valuable insights. As we said, the slides will be disseminated as well. And we hope that this can be applied to your company or in your particular roles as well. Before we go, we'd just like to ask you, there is a poll up just to rate the forum. We would appreciate your participation. And again, we look forward to seeing all of you in the upcoming SAMED events. So have a wonderful afternoon further.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jonathan.